The Grand Dining Hall. Local time, 12:10. Emma. The dining hall was, for all intents and purposes, the den of gossip. Grand Dining Hall. Add. Alternative designator. Den of gossip. This was proven true by the incessant and rampant whispers, most of which were eventually hidden under privacy screens, but some of which were allowed to permeate through the air like a foul and sickening stench. What's he trying to prove? Usurpers. Tepid blood minor nobles thinking themselves big shots in their ill-gotten castles. This is all they know. Power through brute strength. Do you think this could be some sort of a roundabout statement for the house choosing ceremony? Could be. Or maybe the new realmer is rubbing off on him. I heard those savages live in hunting packs that deal exclusively in violence. Poor Lord Ping. The man's been dealt so many blows both to his ego and integrity. He truly is the victim in this upstart rebellion. Let us hope the pious Ping prevails over his undeserving trials and tribulations. The man's a saint, a pious soul that must hold fast with those of us adherent to the eternal truths. Or perhaps we should wait and see how things develop. I, for one, wish to neither side with the narrow-minded bull, nor the aggressive upstarts. Lord Quiv may prove to be the most suitable candidate for class sovereign, but only time will tell. Never in my wildest of imaginations would I have ever considered that the one to threaten our position, our place, our image, and our very survival in this sky of feral drakes, to be you, Prince Thalmin. Eleanor managed out incredulously, breaking me out of my long-range acoustic reverie. Though, unlike his prior confirmations with myself, his current voice lacked the same intense vitriol. Instead, that was replaced with what I could only describe as a genuine sense of disappointment, as if confronting a friend who knew better than to commit to a dumb decision. That's an understandable statement to make, Eleanor. Thalmin replied uncharacteristically calmly, as if he hadn't even registered the Venerian's assaults. Or at least that seemed to be the case until he shot the deluxe kobold a predatory side-eye. Because creatures that lack honor, integrity, and personal dignity often conflate sacrifices and risk-taking for foolishness and idiocy. For within the heart of a Nexian lies only compromise for the sake of convenience, whether that be the convenience of survival, the convenience of continuity, or the convenience of the status quo. You will sacrifice everything to maintain it, even if it means allowing your honor to remain sullied and trodden where there exists a pool to cleanse away that shame. Thasia's eyes grew wary with concern at that statement, one of the few instances I've seen her genuinely worried about an Eleanor-Thalmin interaction. In fact, even I didn't dare to interrupt, especially after both parties had shot death glares towards our elven waiter as he arrived with the lunch platter. Restraint, Prince Thalmin, Eleanor responded with a deep and calculating breath. This isn't the adjacent realms. This isn't Havenbrock realm. Oh, that much is very clear to me, Eleanor, Thalmin interjected with something just short of a growl. In Havenbrock realm, we would sooner slash, stab, flay, or lash our enemies in fair and open combat than reduce ourselves to cowardly attempts at assassination, or retreat with our tails between our legs at the earliest signs of defeat. Eleanor took another breath, placing a small hand atop of his snout. I empathize with your desires to follow through with what you believe is a morally sound decision, the Venerian responded in a surprising display of maturity. However, and this goes for you as well, New Realmer. He paused for a moment, taking the time to glare at me before shifting back to Thalmin. We are not acting as independent actors anymore. For better or for worse, which, mind you, I still strongly believe this is very much for the worse in my case, we are now a peer group, and as such the actions we take and their resultant fallout should represent the interests of us all. These are bold claims, Thalmin began with a restrained snarl. Even bolder when considering your actions the week prior. If the measure of a man were dictated by his words alone, then I would be inclined to acquiesce. However, considering the measure of a man extends beyond the weightless chatter of an exhaled breath, I feel far more inclined to reserve such actions for those far more deserving of my respect. At which point, The Lupinor turned towards both Thacia and I, following that up with a dip of his head. I apologize, Thacia, Emma, for conducting myself in the way I did. Thalmin took a moment to pause, side-eyeing Eleanor as he acknowledged him once again. Whilst his character may sully his words, there is some truth to him. I have admittedly overstepped my bounds in committing to an action which undeniably affects the group. However, I genuinely hope you understand the reasons behind my otherwise brash decision, for I must stand on principle lest I decide to stand at all. Given the crap Oris ping-ponged last night, I'm inclined to agree with you, Thalmin. More than that, I would have gladly taken your place and duelled him the good old-fashioned way if I could. Besides, the look on his face when you chose him to be your dueling partner, it was just priceless, I offered with a snide grin. In all seriousness, I'm really not in a position to chastise anyone on the issue of just gunning it with your gut instinct anyways. Heck, the entirety of last week was one long drawn-out escapade for my sake, which came at the expense of the group after all. I chuckled nervously. So, yeah, this is incredibly tame by those standards, Thalmin. Whilst unexpected and indeed a risk, I can understand the reasons behind it, Thalmin. Thacia nodded uneasily. However, I do not advise any of you to make a habit out of this, she commanded, making an effort to make individual eye contact with each and every one of us. Thacia's group mum vibes were definitely showing at this point, which was probably for the better. Given the group seemed to be a magnet for this sort of thing, it was good to have an anchor of sorts. Sure thing, Mum, was what my gut instinct screamed at me to say. But instead I decided to tone it down a notch. As you command, Princess. I dipped my head in acknowledgement, garnering a look of abashed confusion from Thacia, and just plain old confusion from the other two. In any case, I believe you wish to discuss matters outside of classroom priorities, Emma. Thacia quickly attempted to shift past that little bit of prodding, which I obliged with an affirmative nod. Yep. Well, it's more of a small change of plans that I think is worth discussing with you guys. So, you remember how I was planning on deploying an infil drone on Maltori after the end of class, right? All three nodded, urging me to continue. Well, since Maltori was a no-show, and with Lariel taking the reins instead, I think it's best if we stick with the plan anyways, just swapping out Maltori for Lariel. I honestly don't see any other way we can continue the library's quest line, or any other way to find evidence to support the Oris Ping Maltori hypothesis we have going on. I know it's a huge gamble since there's no way of knowing if she'll even head to Maltori's office after class, but honestly, this is our best shot right now. I concur, Emma, Thalmin announced with a nod. Given her proximity to the Professor's orbit, we may in fact gain a greater bearing on his actual state, which in itself may prove useful, Thacia offered, more or less acknowledging my change of plans implicitly. We don't seem to have any other choice, Frelma, so a shot in the dark is better than stowing your wand, Eleanor acknowledged, in a rare display of solidarity. It's settled then. I'll deploy the drone right after class is dismissed. Then we wait and see what the drone comes up with. The Grand Concourse of Learning. The Hall of Light. Local time, 1400 hours. Emma. Mana-filled perception was, as one would expect, dry, bland, and utterly nonsensical. Throughout most of it, the lesson was taught as if it was referencing something obvious, something mundane, something so typical that a lot of the topics were all but overlooked as self-evident. A lot of what was taught reminded me of a mix between perception theory and situational awareness training. However, instead of relying on your eyes, ears, heck, even your nose or sense of touch, it was instead relying on something completely outside of the human experience. Mana-field perception is, at its core, a subject that is inherent to the sapient condition. However, the extent to which it is appreciated, understood, and most important of all, applied, varies exponentially. To an untrained mind and an untempered soul, the world feels tepid. The apprentice paused, gesturing to Sorosar, who answered his cue by pulling out a massive painting of a beautiful mountainscape that seemed to play through a closed animation loop. The effect was like a high-definition e-ink display. To a trained mind but an untempered soul, the world feels distant, unaccommodating, and frustrating to emotionally comprehend, Lariel continued, prompting Sorosar to pull out yet another painting. This one, the exact same as the first, with literally no differences between them. To an untrained mind, but a tempered soul, the world feels unpredictable, erratic, and frustrating to logically put together. Once again, another painting was brought out. This one, just like the other two, looked completely identical. But to a sufficiently trained mind and a tempered soul, with enough time invested into both theory and practice, the world becomes open, expansive, and above all else, it becomes rich with sights and sensations that would be impossible to feel with the physical form alone, Lariel concluded, just as Sorosar pulled out what looked to be yet another identical painting. The Evis analysis concluded that there were absolutely no differences between the four paintings. Moreover, the mana radiation signatures for each were likewise exactly the same. It was only after slipping a note towards Thacia with a question written in Hynexian did I finally get my answer. What's the deal with these paintings? They're all identical. Thacia quickly slipped me a blank piece of parchment in response. Though it didn't remain blank for long, as words and sentences started appearing on it, mirroring Thacia's furious note-taking in her own notebook. They're artisanal pieces imbued with the purposeful manipulation of the subject's aura, mana field, and the surrounding mana. They were brought out in order to demonstrate the different degrees of mana field perception by exaggerating the most common shortcomings found in those training in the magical arts. The first piece was similar to your memory shards, lacking in any mana fields or auras. The second and third pieces demonstrated a failure to imbue one or the other of the two fundamental tenets of mana field perception. The fourth piece is representative of a perfect balance of both tenets, and is an exquisite work of art that completely outshines the first. It radiates beauty, whilst the first is flat and lifeless. It took a moment for me to really register all that. Longer still, as I eventually became fixated on that last line in particular. Flat and lifeless. Is that what the world is like from my eyes? It was around that time that a thought hit me, and a realization truly sank deep into my very being. The world that Thacia, Thawin, Eleanor, and the rest of the magical beings across the interdimensional plane experienced was one that I was utterly blind to. It had been referenced before. In fact, it had been drilled into me time and time again by the likes of Eleanor that I was lacking in something fundamental. But up until now, everything was either circumstantial or outside of my general focus. So much so that I never was able to digest the implications of it. However, as much as a pit formed in my stomach, growing tighter by the second as Lariel went on and on about the ebbs and flows of mana, so too did a very human resolve suddenly dawn upon me. I'm going to see what you guys see one day, I wrote down on Thacia's magic paper. How? Was the message I received back, to which I only had one thing to reply with. The same way we overcame all of our other shortcomings, I wrote cryptically, garnering a look of confusion from Thacia as she read the note, to which I only had to point to my armor for added effect. By once again defying nature, I thought to myself. If we weren't born with the ability to see this beauty, we'd find a way to break it down into its fundamental components, dissect it, analyze it, and then reinterpret it for ourselves. The class continued on after that exchange of notes, as we touched upon what Eleanor had so eloquently described on that second day of the grace period. 1. That mana streams were everywhere around us. 2. That mana fields generated by living organisms were akin to rocks that not only parted those streams, but at times interacted with them. 3. That using mana fields, one can make out the presence of other mana fields through the mana streams, and thus detect and extract information as is pertinent to the context of the situation. And while Eleanor would have blabbered on and on about the ability to see and sense the emotional state of others through the mana streams, what Lariel seemed to be focused on instead were the practical applications of this natural ability. Namely, she focused on exactly how to detect a spell being cast, what sort of spell was being cast, and most importantly, she focused on how it all tied back to light magic. In summary, only when one is proficient in the detection and analysis of mana fields can one finally start to dissect the intricacies of a mana field during spellcasting. And only once one masters the detection of spellcasting can one even hope to begin the process of dispelling, the first step of which is to know exactly what a mana field looks like during spellcasting. Is there anyone in the class that can tell me what that looks like? The professor asked, looking around before picking one of the many raised hands. This one belonged to Quiv. Yes, Lord Quiv. Influxes and effluxes, Professor. One will see the influx of ambient mana through the mana streams into a mana field, and the potential efflux of mana through a mana field back into the mana streams in the flow of a controlled mana construct. Very good, Lord Quiv. 5 points. Now, hold your thoughts on that latter part, because that ties into my next question. Lariel responded, with a giddiness and chippiness that seemed to be lacking in every other class up to this point. The fundamental means of detecting a spell being cast is by looking out for a point of influx and a point of efflux. Influx being the more difficult of the pair to detect, for what you have to look out for is mana is being funneled into a mana field. A weak spell being cast will incur less disruptions in a mana stream. However, the opposite is also true. As the more powerful the spell, and the more powerful the mage, the greater the rate of influx, as the amount of mana needed to fulfill the requirements of the spell increases. Paradoxically, this would mean it would be easier to detect a powerful spell before it is cast, as the reduction in the concentration of ambient mana will be more palpable as a result. Efflux, however, is rather straightforward, and will be the primary vehicle through which mana field perception will be taught, as it is through efflux that we can ascertain the most useful details of a spell, or as Lord Quiv so eloquently puts it, the mana construct. Does anyone know what this next point may be referring to? Surprisingly, and out of a clear bias towards Quiv, Lariel once more called him up. I couldn't blame her though. The man, despite being a certified bully and teacher's pet, was one of the few students who didn't openly doubt the apprentice's capabilities during the start of class. Yes, Lord Quiv. The mana construct refers to the skeleton of a spell, the arrangement and unique form it takes before manifesting into a proper spell. The Gorn-like lizard responded confidently. Outstanding, Lord Quiv. 5 points. Now, whilst a mana construct is indeed a vital step in the process of spellcasting, its manifestation is rarely the point in time in which a spell can be intercepted, save for those who have mastered the art of light magic. As a result, a spell can be halted before it even has the chance to form. To most, however, the mana construct acts as a cue to prepare. It is a signal that demonstrates the irrefutable start to a spell, and as a result it provides major structural clues as to the form of light magic that must be employed to combat it, which leads me to my next point. The apprentice once more paused as she manifested literally nothing visible to the tune of more than a dozen mana radiation warnings. When broken down to their basic components, every spell is a complicated meshwork of mana, channeled and contained within a dynamic pattern that continuously evolves throughout the duration of a spell, because unlike artificing, the casting of magic evolves with unpredictability and thrives on organic change. No offense to you, of course, Professor Pliska. The apprentice turned towards Sorasar worryingly, who simply responded with a bellowing laugh. None taken, my aspiring understudy. With that, Lariel continued, her hands moving through an empty section of air that everyone seemed to be focused on, as if manipulating a hologram that I wasn't privy to. However, in spite of this unpredictability, the goal of light magic, and mana field perception in particular, is to untangle the aforementioned meshwork of mana. For every spell is a puzzle and a series of knots to untangle. Your goal in this class, if I am to be reductive, is to untangle the complex mesh that comprises a spell, unravelling it to a point in which it can no longer maintain its form, collapsing it and thus rendering it inert. The apprentice emphasized this by miming what looked to be tiny little motions with her fingers before pulling both hands backwards, garnering a series of affirmative nods from the crowd. And with that, we now reach the conclusion of today's class.
Or more accurately, the lead up to the climax of this class.
Sorosar quickly chimed in with a wave of his hand, prompting the room to change once more. Section upon section of the front of the classroom's floor was dragged down into the impossible void, only to be replaced just as quickly by an elevated stage resembling that of a fencing strip.
Will the aspiring duelists please rise and approach the stage?
Sorosar turned back towards the crowd, prompting both Thalmin and Oris to stand, the pair giving each other some strong side-eyes before both marching up and towards the front of the class. From there, with not a single word exchanged, they took their places, Thalmin at the far right and Oris on the far left. The purpose of this demonstration is simple, the apprentice began, as Sorosar began moving towards both Thalmin and Oris, insisting them to pay attention. It is to show that even in spite of the complicated principles behind light magic, that there exists far simpler, far more basic principles that can achieve similar means. A precursor to more contemporary methods, spellbreaking. A maneuver that involves overpowering the structure and flow of a spell using a concentrated burst of pure mana irregardless of the type. However, unlike traditional dispelling seen in contemporary light magic, spellbreaking oftentimes requires a user to concentrate a disproportionately larger amount of mana in order to properly break a spell. It is thus highly inefficient, and as a result becomes rapidly impractical upon encountering spellcrafts of sufficiently advanced tiers. This demonstration will be aptly limited to a simple barrier spell for the likes of the Reciprocator, so as to not overburden the initiator with this simple task. The apprentice quickly passed on the torch to Sorosar, who quickly took center stage with a few steps.
Now, as this is not a traditional duel for dominance, nor is it a sporting duel for the purposes of victory, I will explain the narrow context by which this duel will be held. Sorosar continued, his hands clapping together, generating an empty and resonant clang in the process. To our right is our initiator, who will be demonstrating the principles of spellbreaking in an active capacity. To our left is our reciprocator, who will be taking on the role of demonstrative spellcaster, casting only barrier spells for the duration of this short demonstration. Remember, there is to be no additional spells cast or demonstrated outside of these parameters. Is that clear?
Sorosar paused, making sure to meet both of the opponent's gazes with his empty helm.
Yes, Professor!
Both parties shouted simultaneously, barely containing their frustrations beneath a veneer of calm and restrained fury. Then we shall begin on the count of 3, the apprentice continued, taking the reins over from Sorosar as she stood just a few steps away from the stage's combat lines. 1, she began, as Oris began moving into position, practically grinding his booted hooves into the stage, and taking on the posture of some unknown martial artist. 2. Thalmin reciprocated by taking a more aggressive posture, as if positioning himself to leap towards the ball in a ravenous rage at the drop of a hat. 3. Alert! Localized surge of mana radiation detected. 225% above background radiation levels. Alert! Localized surge of mana radiation detected. 350% above background radiation levels. Nothing seemed to happen, at least not to my eyes. Within a matter of seconds, all I witnessed were 2 mana radiation warnings, time-logged as only a few seconds apart from one another. No physical effects were evident to me. Nothing, except for the flinching of a few muscles and the waving of arms, as if they were conjuring make-believe magic spells, without the added special effects that came with it. Ironically, this was how I was expecting most Nexians to react to the reveal of laser weaponry. Silent, invisible, but otherwise omnipresent and deadly threats. Though despite the lack of any physical effects I could discern, there was certainly more than enough context clues to go by when it came to exactly what had just occurred. Oris's features had more or less swelled up into a fury. His nostrils flared just short of snorting out fumes, and his teeth were bared, clearly holding back a few choice words for the now grinning Thalmin.
Again,
he demanded, and barely a second after a nod of approval from the apprentice came 2 more mana radiation warnings. Alert! localized surge of mana radiation detected, 300% above background radiation levels. Alert! Localized surge of mana radiation detected, 425% above background radiation levels. Once again, no noticeable physical effects are manifested. Though judging from the bewildered and shocked expressions of the crowd, something was definitely happening within the invisible world that was accessible through mana vision. "Again!" Ping announced, barely garnering approval from the apprentice this time, as things took a sudden enough turn that even I could notice them. Alert! Localized surge of mana radiation detected, 400% above background radiation levels. It started with that barrier again. Alert! Localized surge of mana radiation detected, 500% above background radiation levels. Followed by Thalmin overpowering it. However, instead of letting things go, Ping instead pushed towards a frenzied series of attacks. Alert! Localized surge of mana radiation detected, 375% above background radiation levels. As one. Alert! Localized surge of mana radiation detected, 400% above background radiation levels. After another. Alert! Localized surge of mana radiation detected, 400% above background radiation levels. After another. Alert! Localized surge of mana radiation detected, 400% above background radiation levels. After another barrier spell seemed to actually be causing Thalmin some pushback now. His movements now resembled someone attempting to dodge invisible projectiles, yet always made no moves to actually fling anything at him, only maintaining his prior stance. Though, of course, this came with the same expected response. As Thalmin reiterated with his own attacks, or rather one very large attack that truly outclassed what Auris could currently muster in his furious state. Alert! Localized surge of mana radiation detected, 550% above background radiation levels. This spell that mildly shook the room seemed to be enough to break the sudden incursion, prompting both Ping and Thalmin to turn towards the apprentice, the former blasting steam from his snout and the latter slashing his tail in the air, for yet another round of fighting, only to have Sorasar step in, placing a hand on both of the duelists, who were barely a foot away from each other now.
Wonderful! Excellent! Put your hands together for our introductory duelists, everyone!
The professor quickly coerced both of the parties to face the class, actively grabbing them by the small of their back, and thus effectively entrapping them with his iron grip, forcing them to face the class, who cheered on with a series of applause. Not a second later, the pair of them bowed, though it was unclear how much of this was Sorasar's doing, and how much of this was done out of their own will.
In any case, seeing as both of our aspiring duelists have gone above and beyond in this demonstration, and seeing that this is merely a demonstration and not a challenge, Sorasar emphasized that last point, forcing the pair to sweat in his over-shoulder grip, I believe it would be prudent to award them each a fair share of this duel's 50 points.
Given the enthusiasm shown, I am inclined to agree, Professor Blisker. The apprentice quickly nodded, prompting the armourer to quickly push both of them off stage, and back towards the staggered raised steps of the lecture hall. 25 points for both of our duelist groups, Lariel reiterated, and with a final round of reluctant applause, barely overpowering the incoming band, marking the end of class. The apprentice made her final statement. This concludes this week's first lesson. Considering the house choosing ceremony coming up this weekend, along with the LSA school supplies shopping trip to town, I'm inclined to grant this class some clemency. No homework will be required. So please, enjoy the rest of the day, and prepare yourselves for what could be the most decisive day in your academic career here in Transglacia. Class dismissed. No sooner were those words uttered did my eyes quickly turn towards my HUD, and a flash of commands came through without a second of delay. Info drone 01A, active. Status, nominal. Objective, priority tracking and reconnaissance of subject A109. Mission parameters, track, observe, map, and return to base within predetermined parameters. Confirm command. Yes or no? Command confirmed, I replied vocally, prompting the newly printed replacement drone to pop out of his docking bay before charting a course parallel to that of the apprentice. The drone's signal was lost just as the apprentice left the room through that dark threshold behind the lectern, at which point the entire class began shuffling out to the tune of the encroaching band. Only time would tell what would come of this mission. But hopefully, we'll get our answers sometime later this evening. However, instead of blending right into the crowd, or more specifically being ignored by said crowd, quite a few eyes managed to find their way onto our group. Moreover, the chatter seemed way too interesting to ignore. You were right, Sithis. Perhaps there is something about this mercenary prince after all. A female voice spoke from an all-girl group, eliciting a series of giggles, which were promptly silenced by a privacy screen the moment Thalmin craned his head around.
Lord Orish Ping has yet again demonstrated his integrity. Let us ensure his pure-hearted determination is lauded this evening, lads. The fearsome strikers shall band together with the most pious of intent.
A turtle-like turtle jeered, moving strategically to position themselves around Orish Ping's group as the expected schmoozing began in full. New Realmer? Eleanor began, generating a privacy screen in the process. Yes, Eleanor? How long do you expect your insect to take in its dastardly escapades? Last time it took a good few hours, so given this probably isn't a one-and-done deal, I'd say maybe 3 to 4 hours at the least this time around, I offered. Well then, splendid. I shall be off and return within that time frame. Wait. Hold up. Where do you think you're going? I inquired firmly. I have my own life to lead, New Realmer. Now please, I shall return to our group's escapades in due time. Where, Eleanor? I reiterated. To which the Venerian could only sigh in response. The student lounge. Top floor today, if I am to be interrogated for every ounce of information. Then let's go. Together, I proclaimed, garnering a few looks of surprise from both Thacia and Thalmin. Perhaps it's time we start getting a feel for the lay of the land. We've been cooped up in our own little world for far too long. Maybe, just maybe, we should all expand our horizons just by a little bit.